We're going to start off by classifying joints. You can do that both structurally and functionally. We've studied in Chapter 5 the tissues. One type of tissue is dense connective tissue. Another type of tissue is cartilage. Not really elastic cartilage, but fibrocartilage or hyaline cartilage. And the last category is fluid encased by a joint capsule. So if we are going to classify and give these a name, the dense connective tissue, usually dense regular or dense irregular connective tissue, that has lots of collagen fibers, so we classify that as a fibrous joint. If it contains cartilage, we're going to classify it as cartilaginous. The fluid-filled ones are going to be our synovial joints. If you're an immobile joint, that means that you have no movement, and we call this synarthroses. Slightly mobile means there's just a little bit of movement, and we call that amphiarthrosis. When we have an ES, it's plural. IS would be singular. I'm going to put amphiarthroses for the plural. We've already talked about amphipathic molecules, so this is kind of in between, where you've got a little bit functioning as immobile and a little bit functioning as mobile, so it's kind of in between. Amphiarthrosis. The freely moving joints, we classify these as diarthrosis. Diarthroses in plural. To remember this, you can say that it makes you so sad that you went from immobile to mobile. This chart's giving you the classification. On the top, we're saying what is the structural classification, so it's giving you that description. Here is the functional classification. So we're going to take a look at what different types of joints that we have. You can look in your book for examples. There should be a handout that kind of goes with this, where you have this chart and you can fill it in yourself. So if you are looking at that, I recommend that you pause this and try to fill in the chart yourself and then come back to it. But we're going to classify some examples. So here we go. Fibrous synarthroses. So these are usually dense regular connective tissue that have no movement. Remember, no movement in the immobile synarthroses. So what types of joints are we going to talk about there? Gomphosis. This is how the teeth are in your mouth and jaw. Also, sutures of the skull. We'll learn about specific sutures of the skull that you have to name for lab. Cartilaginous synarthroses. This can include the epiphyseal plate. That's that hyaline cartilage in the epiphyses of bones. Another example would be costal cartilage. Those are the cartilage between your ribs and the sternum. I'm going to switch now before we get into whether there's a synovial synarthroses. We're going to give some examples of fibrous and cartilaginous amphiarthroses. So this is slight movement again. Fibrous, we're going to have something called a syndesmosis. This is another classification. This means that you have a flat sheet, or it's also called an interosseous membrane. We're going to find these between different long bones. The radius and the ulna, there's going to be an interosseous membrane making up the syndesmosis, which is the syndesmosis means a fibrous amphiarthrosis. A symphysis is the cartilaginous amphiarthrosis. Specific examples of symphysis would be the pubic symphysis. We'll learn about that for lab. Also your intervertebral discs. Now notice cartilaginous can be hyaline or fibro. If you look what these are hyaline cartilage, and these are both fibrocartilage. And note they are in separate classifications here. That'll be important. We don't have synovial synarthroses or synovial amphiarthroses, nor do we have fibrous diarthroses or cartilaginous diarthroses. The only thing that you can have are your synovial joints. Synovial joints are always classified as a diarthrosis, freely moving. So this would include examples. We'll study 6 of them in lab, but we'll just name one example here. So your knee joint. So if we were going to think about a fibrous synarthrosis, which is not freely moving, so we'd want it over here, low on the movement scale, but the dense regular connective tissue is pretty stable. So that's going to give us, if we're going to place a point on this graph, would be here. Okay. Now the synovial joints, as you allow for lots of movement, you're actually going to compromise on the stability. So if we put another data point here, so in general you can say, you draw a line, this line is showing you that there's an inverse relationship between the stability and the range of motion allowed at a joint. The more stable you are, the less movement you allow. The more movement you allow, the less stable you are. This is how your book depicts that. So same concept as the last slide. I just drew a little graph for you. But the immobile joints are the most stable. The more that you increase in mobility, the less that you have in stability, so you're unstable. And then of course your amphiarthroses are pretty stable in the middle. Some important fibrous joints. So on the chart we mentioned that there's certain sutures in the skull. Sutures are where the bones are connecting. There are fibrous joint between them. So we have dense regular connective tissue connecting those skull bones that allows the skull to function as a unit. So there's many, many different bones in the skull, and when we get to the axial portion of the lab for axial skeleton, you'll start learning all of those names and things. But I've tried to color code them right here for you. Again, this is something we'll address in lab, so the name of the sutures. But you have the coronal suture. Notice it is going in that coronal plane. Okay? The coronal suture is between the frontal bone, and there's 2, you're only seeing one here, but a parietal. These are both parietal here. These back here are the occipital, and this is your temporal. So your bones here between the frontal and the parietal on the left side and the parietal on the right side. As you can see, the coronal is also here in purple. The squamous suture is here in orange, and that is going because it's named because the big flat part of the temporal bone, another name for flat, squamous, remember we talked about squamous epithelial cell shape, means flat. So squamous part of the temporal bone gives rise to the squamous suture. There's the lambdoid or lambdoidal, and that is between the parietal bones and the occipital bone. The sagittal is going to run mid-sagittally, so we're going with that sagittal theme of the planes or sections of the body, and that's going to be between the 2 parietal bones. And the last one that we have to talk about is the occipitomastoid, and that's between the occipital bone, which is right here, and the mastoid process of the temporal bone. This is called the mastoid process, which is where you're getting that occipitomastoid naming.
Other fibrous joints include syndesmoses. Syndesmoses are classified by having an interosseous membrane.
This is a ligamentous sheet. There's one between the radius and ulna, and there's one between the tibia and the fibula. There's also some in your ankle, although we don't, these are the biggest ones. Okay. Syndesmoses, we put that, how did we classify that movement? We classified it as an amphiarthrosis, so slight movement making it an amphiarthrosis. This allows for the rotation, especially as we pronate and supinate our forearm. Gomphoses, these are our teeth. There's these periodontal membranes, which are the dense connective tissue. These should be immobile. We don't want our teeth rattling around as we're eating and talking. Other important cartilaginous joints. So the epiphyseal plate, we should have addressed this a little bit during the ossification process in chapter 7. So this is a leftover remnant of the hyaline cartilage from the fetal skeleton, and this allows the long bones to grow in length. We also have the costal cartilage. So costal cartilage is something that you'll need to know for lab also. But that is a synchondrosis. Synchondrosis, how would we classify that? Well, we are a cartilaginous joint. And how would we classify it with the mobility? We would classify this as a synarthrosis. So no movement. Symphysis is the specific name for things that are classified as cartilaginous. I'm just going to put cart for cartilaginous. And they are also classified as the amphiarthrosis. I'm just going to put amphi. So the pubic symphysis, this is fibrocartilage here. Okay, between the os coxae, each one of these is called an os coxa, so os coxae in plural. And between your vertebrae, so at the intervertebral disc, which is fibrocartilage. So again, with the symphysis, we're all fibrocartilage. And synchondroses were hyaline cartilage. So how would we classify? Let's just march through. What is hyaline cartilage? Is gomphosis? No. Suture? No. Where do we have hyaline cartilage? Only at a synchondrosis. So that's the only place, so we are done with that one. Where do we find fibrocartilage? These are all fibrous. These are cartilaginous. So fibrocartilage makes the difference. The symphysis is fibrocartilage. So we're done with that one. The periodontal membranes, this is specific to the gomphosis. Okay, so we know that that is the only one there. Dense regular connective tissue. Okay, this goes for any fibrous joint. These are all fibrous joints, so we could put D, D, D here. We know that these are cartilaginous, so they don't have dense regular connective tissue, which would be a fibrous joint. Teeth, again, that's very specific to the gomphosis. You're holding your teeth in at that particular joint. Sagittal suture. The sagittal suture is an example of the suture here, so we'll put that here. Epiphyseal plate. This is hyaline cartilage. So where do we have hyaline cartilage? At the synchondroses. So we put it here. Costal cartilage, same thing. That's cartilage. So we're down here in the cartilaginous. We'll add it to the synchondroses. Intervertebral discs. That would be the symphysis. Interosseous membrane. This is specifically a fibrous joint. So which type of fibrous joint would we be looking at? And that would be the syndesmoses. So J goes there. Cartilaginous joint. Each one of these should be classified as the cartilaginous. Okay? Just like all of these are the fibrous joint. Then we have synarthroses versus amphiarthroses. So let's look and see which ones are synarthroses, which means no movement. And then, so gomphoses, this should be no movement. Suture should be, that's an M. Suture should be no movement. The syndesmoses, those are those interosseous membranes, so we want amphiarthroses there. Synchondrosis, this is no movement, so M. And the symphysis, there's slight movement, N. So gomphoses, we have C, D, E, L, M. Suture, we have D, F, L, M. Syndesmoses, we have D, J, L, N. Synchondrosis, we have A, G, H, K, M. Symphysis, we have B, I, K, N.
So how can I keep these straight? Well, with gomphosis, I want to think about maybe...
Oh, we're gnawing on some food. Suture has lots of U's in it. Skull also has a U in it. These all start with the synd, either or S-Y-N. So D, syndesmosis, dense regular connective tissue. Synchondrosis, remember chondro is that cartilage prefix, such as the costal cartilage. Now, symphysis is also cartilage, but it's the fibrocartilage that you find in the pelvic bone, which is called the os coxa, where the pubic symphysis is. The rest of chapter 9 we'll be studying the synovial joints, and we're going to use a packet, and we're going to use our time in lab, and we're going to use lots of videos to look at these joints instead of looking at it in a traditional lecture. But at this time, I just want to introduce the basic of the synovial joints. The major characteristics is that we have two bones separated by a joint cavity. So most of the joints in your body are going to be synovial joints. These are going to allow for the movement. You probably know some of them and will be at least a little bit familiar with a couple of the ones that we're going to study in detail. Again, these are always classified as diarthroses. They're always freely moving. What are the basic features? There's an articular capsule in the joint cavity. So the articular capsule has two layers. We'll talk about that in a minute. But this here is the joint capsule. The synovial fluid is in the joint cavity. So the cavity is the space, the synovial fluid is filling the space. Just like we had the cavities in the space for the serous membranes when we studied chapter 1.
Articular cartilage is made out of the tissue type hyaline cartilage.
The hyaline cartilage is all right here. So it's lining the end caps of the bones. You're seeing it here. The book and different pictures usually show it in like a glossy white or off-white. So here's the hyaline cartilage known as articular cartilage. Ligaments can be part of the articular capsule or they can be extrinsic to the articular capsule. So the joint capsule or articular capsule are both the same thing. We're just using a slightly different name. Other characteristics include that we're going to find nerves which innervated means that you have nerves in the tissue. Vascularized means that you have blood vessels in the tissue or structure. More about the articular capsule. So again, it's a double layer. There's the fibrous layer, which is shown in this light blue here on both sides. Okay. So these, a lot of times, these are ligaments that we've named. You can have part of the fibrous capsule, articular capsule, that is not a particular ligament. A lot of the times we just have like a very thick part of that articular capsule that we name as a specific ligament. Other ligaments will have not part of the joint capsule or articular capsule that are not holding that fluid in.
So right under that fibrous layer, you see that little pink layer. That is the inner synovial membrane.
What makes up a membrane? Body membranes. Remember, synovial membranes is one type of that body membranes. We looked at that in chapter 5, did that definition. You always have epithelium and underlying connective tissue making the body membrane. So we have some squamous epithelium here, and then we have areolar connective tissue, right? So this is that loose connective tissue of the connective tissue proper, squamous epithelium. This synovial membrane's main job is to produce the synovial fluid. So the synovial fluid will fill the joint cavity.
So the joint cavity is filled with synovial fluid, which is a viscous, oily fluid.
It lubricates the articular cartilage. Makes it this articular cartilage, when it's lubricated, makes it a very slippery surface so that you're not grinding your bones against each other and causing tissue damage when you're moving your joints. We're also going to nourish and remove the waste from the chondrocytes. So hyaline cartilage does not have innervation, or sorry, not innervation. Well, I guess it doesn't really have that much innervation, but it does not have vasculature. Right? We don't have lots of blood vessels going to the cartilage. We looked at that when we studied chapter 5 tissues. So where are those chondrocytes getting their nourishment from and the washing over to remove the waste? That is coming from the synovial fluid. Thirdly, it acts as a shock absorber. This is good because we're using these joints. We're usually walking around, running, jumping, all of those things. So it's contributing to protection as a shock absorber. Ligaments, again, ligaments and tendons, they are both made up of the same type of tissue. So that is the dense, regular connective tissue of the connective tissue proper. Okay. We define them differently. Ligaments are bone to bone. Tendons usually connect bone to muscle, although they can be in between muscles too. I like to think of this as ligaments connect the same thing. Tendons tend to connect something different, like bone to muscle instead of bone to bone. Tendons can strengthen the joint. Ligaments play a much larger role. Okay. There's two types of ligaments. You are either an intrinsic ligament, which means you're part of that joint capsule. How would you know if you're an intrinsic ligament? Well, if you damaged that and took that away and you were starting to leak synovial fluid from that joint, then you would know that you were part of the joint capsule because the joint capsule is containing the synovial fluid. Extrinsic ligaments do not help contain, they don't define the joint cavity and they don't contain the fluid, but they can help stabilize, strengthen, reinforce the joints. Talking about tendons and joint, there's something called bursa or bursae in plural. So a bursa is very, very similar to a joint except for you're not forming it around where two bones meet. So the joint capsule has the outer fibrous layer and then an inner synovial membrane. And the bursa does too. So this is and it's filled with synovial fluid. Okay, so this is all similar to the joint capsule, except you're not joining two bones. So what you get are these little fibrous sacs that are filled with synovial fluid, and they act as protection against extra friction. So you will have these all over. We don't name any particular in lab, but as we're going through the joints, you might see them depicted in the pictures and the videos, all these different bursa. If you get inflammation of the bursa, that's called bursitis. So you might have had bursitis or know somebody who has bursitis. That is an inflammation of the bursa. So they're there for extra friction alleviation. Tendon sheaths are basically these really big, elongated bursa. So you're not going around, you're not forming a joint cavity because you're not having the articulation there, but you do, most commonly, we have the tendon sheaths that are found in the wrist and the ankle. Okay, so if you have inflammation of this, you might get carpal tunnel syndrome because you've got inflammation there. If you're pressing down on the nerves that are also there, then you can get numbness and pain and things. So this is an extra protector. A lot of the actual tendons that we have are contained within this bursa. Again, it's a bursa because it's not a joint capsule because there's no bones interconnecting to articulate. Synovial joints, we're going to study specific synovial joints. I have them in a slide or two, the ones that we are going to study. There's going to be some movements that we're going to talk about. Basically, we'll address those movements between the videos and reading in your book. But I want to take a moment to say that we can classify joint movement on axes. So the uniaxial is just one planar direction. Biaxial means there's two planes of direction, and then anything after that, if there's multiple planes of directions, we call that multiaxial.
So there's 6 types of synovial joint movements. In lecture, I'll show you a video and you can find the link on Blackboard, but that will help us to classify, and this chart will actually go through them. So I'll start right now going through them. There's
Plane, hinge, pivot, condylar, also called ellipsoid, saddle, and ball and socket. You're probably most familiar with the ball and socket. That would be your hip and your shoulder. When you go to fill in these shapes, we're going to do this kind of in class and in lab. I should have the answers of how I filled them up posted on Blackboard already. These shapes of the bones kind of are just your description. So are they flat bones? Are they convex? Are they concave? Are they round? Those types of things. So, and again, you're kind of picking arbitrarily what you're labeling as bone 1 or bone 2. Okay, so these might be filled in different as long as you know which bone that you're talking about. The movement, again here, movement can include things like gliding, flexion, extension, rotational movement, special movements such as pronation, supination, maybe even dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, other movements such as abduction, adduction, circumduction, and again, we'll address those in class, lab, and through the videos. The number of axes, these are again 1, 2, 3, uniaxial, biaxial, multiaxial, and specific examples, which you can find from the videos and your book.